The Harlem Renaissance, and we're talking to Drs. Gloria Johnson and Dr. Smith McCoy. And of course, before we had our first commercial break, Dr. Johnson, we were talking about some of the cultural aspects of the Harlem Renaissance. But now, Dr. Smith McCoy, let's have you to talk about some of the things that you mentioned earlier. I think you talked about the Red Summer of 1919. More specifically, let's have you to talk about the problem or the question of race during this period of the Harlem Renaissance. Let's start off with that.
Well, the Harlem Renaissance was, like today, race is a much debated topic. It's something that America was just trying to come to grips with for the first time then, after the antebellum period. And so that you had authors, writers who were creative writers, as well as essayists and sociologists and people who were just interested in furthering the aims of the African American community and the civil rights movement, all focusing on this idea of race and where blacks and blackness fit into the American agenda. And so you had a variety of disagreements, just as we do today, about what it is to be black, and indeed if there is such a thing as a black aesthetic or even black art. The Harlem Renaissance was a time where that was much, much debated. In fact, two anthologies of African American literature came out in 1998, The Norton and The Riverside. And both of them sort of try to give a balance between whether or not this was an artistic movement or was this a movement about propaganda, where is the proper face to show a black America. So the advocates who were sort of dealing with art for art's sake, Alain Locke would have been that person out of Howard University, Harvard trained, as was W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that art was for propaganda, that it had to have a real use to show a particular thing. On the other hand, you had writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and even George Schuyler, who had very radical ideas about what the black aesthetic, or even what the purpose of black writing should be. So that became one of the paramount concerns of the Renaissance.
You know, I think, Dr. Johnson, one of the things I think she mentioned, this effort on the part of Du Bois and others to deal with the African or the black aspect of the African experience. Let's have you to give us some information relative to other folks who fell within that same kind of category.
Okay, let me go back a little bit with Dr. Du Bois, though. Dr. W.B. Du Bois had already been one of the founders of the Niagara movement that later became the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And in that effort, he had developed a journal called The Crisis that was instrumental in the development of the Harlem Renaissance writers and other ideas related to the Harlem Renaissance. Prior to 1920 or so, he had done that journal had included a lot of information regarding social aspects of the race, other kinds of things that were going on, records of lynchings and other kinds of things that were going on. But by the time we started with the Harlem Renaissance around 1920 or so, he had appointed a literary editor who was Jessie Redmond Fawcett, and one of the major writers of the Harlem Renaissance. And she had begun to find other young writers and, in a sense, mentor them or get them published in The Crisis. So The Crisis was one of the leading methods by which people became aware of these new writers, the new Negro writers. The other method that many people learned about the writers was through Opportunity, which was the organ of the Urban League and the National Urban League, which was edited by Dr. Charles S. Johnson. And his approach, again, was to see that the writers were recognized, and one of the things he did was to organize a major dinner every year, and which started in the early 1920s or 1919, 1920. So, and one of the things that he did was to invite a number of white writers and publishers and others who could really further the writers' careers, if possible. And the writers were invited to these dinners, and that's one of the ways that he began a kind of mentoring effort. Also, the prize winners were published in Opportunity magazine. So many of the most popular writers, such as Zora Neale Hurston, Dorothy West, and Langston Hughes, many of them were first known through Opportunity magazine. Their stories and poems were printed in Opportunity, and so people were reading again about the work of the Negro writers, and that was one of the things that furthered that.
And
I
there's
think
a nice Nashville connection,
yes,
too, with the crisis in that for part of the time it was being edited from Fisk University. So again, the seed of the Harlem Renaissance was dispersed at some levels, although the center of it was in Harlem. And in fact, Johnson was very proactive in getting writers and artists and sculptors to move to New York to be a part of this whole process.
You know, it's quite interesting, I think, that both of you have talked about the Opportunity magazine and the Crisis magazine, magazines that we generally think in terms of as being politically oriented, especially the Du Bois and the Crises, the NAACP, and of course the National Urban League. What was the relationship between politics and perhaps this social development here during this period, Dr.?
Politics was never absent. The Harlem Renaissance was a very self-reflexive movement. The writers, the so-called leaders of the movement, those who tried to orchestrate the movement, like Du Bois and Johnson and Locke, were all very much aware of the fact that it was a political movement. And that's, in some respects, why some of the issues were so debated. For instance, should you write art for art's sake, as Locke maintained, or should it be propaganda, as Du Bois suggests, or should it be, like Hughes, a part of the writer himself? A writer should be free to express what him or herself was willing to express. Or is there such a thing as Negro art, as George Schuyler suggests in his essay, The Negro Art Hokum, that there is no real thing as Negro art. And so the writers and indeed the readers were never far removed from the fact that they were in a very political debate at all times.
You know, one of the most interesting things to come out of the Renaissance, I think, as we come up to this first minute, this last minute for this segment, and I don't want to raise another question that will create any more problems for us in terms of time. But I think one of the most interesting things to come out of this movement, as both of you have indicated, is the relationship that these scholars were able to bring to the issue of race. And when we come back during this last segment, I would like for the two of you to address this whole issue of the significance of the Renaissance in reference to what is going on today. Very few people talk about the literature or the philosophical situation that African Americans find themselves in today and make that kind of comparison. And so during the last 6 minutes of this show, we will hopefully have that kind of comparison from you, and we'll be able to sort of end this show for today. But in the meantime, we've got about 16 seconds coming up before our commercial break, and I went into it about 12 seconds too early. But nevertheless, we will be back with our audience to talk about final aspects of the Harlem Renaissance after this short commercial break. Smith-McCoy